Okay, I'm back and we are being recorded live now. Oops, okay, now I've messed up and I got to figure out what's going on here.
Can hear you fine there, Brian.
Hooray.
I think we're okay.
It looks fine.
Okay, because I was getting that echo and I know David's had that issue before, but I think I got it straightened out. So either that or we won't be recording on Facebook. I'm not sure. But anyway, I want to welcome to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School today. We're glad, as they say on Southwest Airlines, we know that you have the choice of many airlines to choose from, and we want to thank you for choosing us. And so we here at the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School want to thank you for joining with us. And so, and David and Bronwyn are on holiday today, recouping. I also want to say publicly here that David has done, and Bronwyn as well, have done an excellent job in the work that they've done in the background to make this class possible. So I just want to say thank you publicly to the Larsons, and they've done a very good job. And you should see the notes that I have on my pad in front of me just to keep busy here. Is Monte on here this morning yet? Okay, I don't see him anyway. So at this time, we're going to start, and we're going to have Robert Ford is going to be our lecturer today. And I have put his curriculum vitae in the chat, and you can go look at that and get more information. I told him by the time I read everything on there, the class would be over. So, and he's been with us. You've been 3 or 4 times, I think, Bob. So we want to thank you for being a participant today and leading out. I have something to start. Bob's going to speak about immigration, and I went to Google and I Googled in welcoming strangers, and I came up with 100 verses in the Bible that had to deal with strangers. So I'm just going to read a couple of them. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Hebrews 13:2. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Leviticus 19. When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And then I'd just like to read, let's see. Exodus 23:9, you shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Shall we bow our heads? Our Father, today we want to thank you for the opportunity to attend our class. We're thankful for the technology of Zoom and other entities that we can do this from many different places. And I want to thank you especially for David and Bronwyn for their work that they've done on this class to make this possible. So again, Lord, thank you for this day. We pray in your name. Amen. Okay, Bob, I'm gonna turn this over to you and you do your thing. Thank you for attending it today.
Yes, well, also want to send greetings to Dave and Bronwyn. Wish them the best today. Just to mention briefly, the website that you put on the chat, that's my website. You need to go to the bottom. You'll see a link that says about, and then there's also a family album. There's there's a bio. And actually today, and in many respects, some of you are older like me, you remember what a mission story was about, okay? And this is going to be, in many respects, a glorified mission story. So we hope not. Let me share my screen now, and we'll see how this goes. And let's see now what we need to do.
You have to share.
Yeah.
They're on the right side of that. No, you're out now.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to go back to
Share
this.
screen. Okay.
Well, let's see if we can get it to hold on a second. Let me go down here.
I think that's it.
Okay. Can you see it now?
I can see a, yes, see a
Okay.
PowerPoint.
Okay, here's the title page. You see it, The Roots of the Immigration Crisis in the quotes, Northern Triangle Countries of Central America.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, and so some of you may know that I'm a geographer, anthropologist. We're going to do a little bit of that and some history and so on to try to understand. But I'm going to start out a little bit with, as I said, this is going to be a family history story in some respects. On my maternal side, my grandmother, Edith Fry, you see here, she was a twin. She studied at nursing at the New England Sanitarium. Some of you may know about that history. And she went during World War I to be a nurse in Puerto Rico. And she was the first of our family to work in Latin America. She came back in 1917 because of a U-boat scare. And she came back to New England Sanitarium, and she was treating during the pandemic, talking about pandemics, a close school friend who was the wife of Horace Standish. She died, and then eventually she remarried her old school friend's husband, who became my maternal grandfather. It's interesting how life goes. He eventually, they moved to California, worked with E.O. Sutherland at the White Memorial Hospital, and then were called and went to Madison, Tennessee at our Madison College, and were quite involved in working with the Black people in that part of the world. That's an interesting story because David wanted me to make a link to some of the CRT things we were talking about last week. We might come back to that if you have any questions. On my paternal side, a lot of you, of course, know about Orley Ford. Orley Ford, okay, there was the book written about the family. These Fords still run. Some of you are old enough to remember this book and to read it. Of course, he went to South America in the 20s, 1917 into 1939, worked in Ecuador and Peru. Is quite a gripping story in many respects. But today I'm going to talk, and then of course, My father went in 1944 from Walla Walla with my mother and to the Bay Islands, the north coast of Honduras. And that's going to bring us to our story today. A little bit of geography, because I think it's important we understand this geography if we're going to understand this immigration crisis. Much of the north coast, we're going to focus on an area called the Bay Islands of Honduras. Some of you may have gone to Roatan to go diving as a really beautiful place. And the north coast, okay. This is a region in which much of the country of Honduras is very low population density, much of its national parks, rainforests, and so on. But the highest population density is really along this coast, particularly in the northwest area. Now, in terms of admin, we'll come back to that because I think it helps to explain a lot of the issues we're going to talk about today. My parents went to the Bay Islands in 1944, and I was born in 1945. And they had a little mission boat, the Herald II. They forgot to paint the II on this boat because the Herald I was a boat that was raised with penny offerings back in the early 1910s by the SDA Church and sent this boat throughout the Caribbean. And the first church that was established, and now is the Inter-American Division, was in the Bay Islands of Honduras. Now, it was the Herald I. And so my parents created their boat, which was the Herald II. Now, as we said, a lot of people, when they think of my family, they think of the work in South America, but actually they spent most of their lives, my grandparents and my parents, in Central America, particularly in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, which is the areas that we're going to talk about today. Just a couple pictures, and we'll talk more about this later. At the top, we have there's my mother and father with the boarding school that was built here. It's over 30 years ago now. Last Sabbath, we were talking a little bit about this, and I mentioned that there was a USAID director in El Salvador who gave a large grant to help build the boarding school in El Salvador, ECAS. This was my parents' home. I went back in 2013 for the 30th anniversary, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. My grandparents here at the bottom, he had his goal, particularly when he was in El Salvador. He wanted to establish a new church and a new school every year that he served, and he did. He almost made that target. That's quite a bit. They were in El Salvador until he died, and then my grandmother stayed there till she was 92, and then she came back. We're looking at the picture at the bottom middle is the Central Church in El Salvador, and the school next door, and across the street is what's now the Adventist bookstore. Ron Lawson, you've probably been to this. And this Adventist bookstore used to be my parents' home, my grandparents' home, and then eventually my parents' home. I remember as a child used to spend summers in this building and so on. So we're going to look at that. Now, let me give some background. I think it'll help to explain a little bit of what the whole issues are. We're going to talk about some places, the Bay Islands, as we mentioned, the North Coast of Honduras. And if you look at the population density map, you'll notice this area of deep red over here and this other area of red. These are the highest densely populated areas of Honduras. This area here has the largest city in the country. It's the largest industrial area. It's also the center of the export agriculture all along the coast. Now, to truly understand this region, we need to understand a term that's come into our lexicon. We call it a banana republic, okay? And whenever we want to say that a country is not doing well or not governed well, we said you're a banana republic. Well, where did that come from? That term came from this region, okay? In Honduras and Nicaragua. This is the area. I think we're getting, someone else has their mute. Okay, so this is an area of that goes back to the 1890s, when American railroad companies and fruit companies established basically fiefdoms in these countries, and they literally bought and sold their own presidents and controlled the countries. These days, it's no longer a Standard Fruit Company or United Fruit Company. It's now Dole Pineapple, okay? And this is a remaining car. And it's no longer the Taylor Railroad, but it's a national railroad, but and so on. Now, as I mentioned, if you folks want to learn more about my family roots in the region, they're on my website. You'll see in my album some of this. And I went back several times a few years ago to the North Coast region where my parents were working. And this is the old United Fruit Company track. It's now abandoned. And this is the old dock in La Ceiba, Honduras, that used to, the banana boats used to go back and forth up to Miami and Galveston and places like that. As I said, today it's Dole Pineapple. It's still major export agriculture. Most of it is mechanized these days. A lot of it is not just in bananas or pineapples, but it's in oil palm. Now, oil palm, as you know, is one of the major sources worldwide of oil that goes into many different products. Unfortunately, it's a highly saturated oil. They were told we shouldn't be using a lot of it. This kind of agriculture, though, is very, very hard on the environment. There's a joke among agriculturalists when it comes to this kind of oil palm. They say if birds fly through an oil palm plantation, they've got to carry their food with them because they're not going to find anything. Because it's literally one of the most impoverished types of agriculture there is in the world. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now, the Bay Islands today have become the primary source of income to the country. Over 40% of the GDP comes from tourism, from fisheries, from export agriculture, on beautiful hotels, and it's quite a place that we need to look at. Now, this is where I'm going to focus first on a story. This is a family story, which I think in some respects explains the history of the region, okay, and some of what's going on. There on the North Coast, back in 1946, the Bay Islanders, who were the first Adventists in the Inter-American Division, the first church was there. They wanted to have their own secondary school. Some of you may not realize, but the Bay Islands up until the 1890s belonged to Britain. When I was a kid growing up in the Bay Islands, I can remember old people who refused to salute the Honduran flag. And they had pictures of Queen Victoria still in their places, and that's who they pledged allegiance to. So it kind of tells you a little bit. Well, the Bay Islanders said, why don't we create a school that will be a bilingual school and train our Adventist young people. This was back in 1944, 45. They created a school. They were able to buy land, 2,000 acres of very beautiful land on the North Coast. This school started out with the intention that every student could come and work their way without paying a nickel, just work their way. The Bay Islanders would ship the fruit that they produced, pineapples, papayas, bananas, using the ships from the Bay Islanders adding us to Miami. Well, it turned out that they were on the railroad owned by the United Fruit Company. And the United Fruit Company didn't want any competition. And so they started to boycott the school. And eventually by 1951, 52, the school had to declare bankruptcy because the union at the time didn't want to spend a few $1,000s to build a dirt road that would bypass the railroad company and allow them to truck things directly to the coast. So the school, which had very high potential, eventually was sold to the government. The government turned around and made it what's today the most important and best known lowland tropical agricultural school in all of Honduras. This is one of those things where you look back and you wonder, could there have been a better way? Okay, let me move ahead now. I've been back and forth to the region many times. In 1998, 99, I was a Fulbright scholar in Honduras at the National University. And I talked to some about this a few months ago when we talked about climate change. And while I was there, of course, several hurricanes came along, including Hurricane Mitch. And I worked at the National University. And we actually had an agreement with NASA and Loma. We did a lot of different things. At the time, one of the more important things, shortly after I came back, Hurricane Mitch arrived, which had been the worst storm in 500 years. Okay, then we went back, including students from Loma in 1999, and that dealt with trauma, helping with the community to deal with the trauma of this hurricane. We worked with ADRA. Later, I went to work for Westminster College in Salt Lake City, and I took students down in 1999 to help with reconstruction of some of the communities that were devastated in the region. Here you can see that even the leaves of the trees were taken off and most of the houses were destroyed. Now, this is not a one-time occurrence. This has continued to happen. And I'll come back to this because I think it helps to explain a lot of the immigration issues. Over the years, between 2003 and 2008, I worked at Loma University. Some faculty that you might know that are still there, and students. We went to Honduras to study some of what's happening in the country, both from an ecological and a human perspective. And this is on the picture at the bottom. I talked about this a few weeks ago. This is the largest mangrove swamp area in Central America, and it's being devegetated to put in shrimp farms. And there's some other problems. So the country, and as we go back north again, this is that north coast area near where my parents had established the school that was going to become the major bilingual Adventist school in the region. This is where it would have been, Frisco. Today, that whole coastal area, much of it was donated back in the 1950s by the United Fruit Company to the government. Because what had happened is that in the 1940s and 50s, a fungal disease came along and destroyed a lot of the banana crops. And so they thought they would get out of growing bananas. And so rather than deal with it, they just donated a bunch of land to the government. The government turned it into a wildlife refuge. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I went back with biologists to study the region and to look at what's happened in this area. Now, this is a picture from the 1920s. kind of give you a sense of the history of the region. Here we have some of the Standard Fruit Company people having a picnic out in what is today this refuge. In fact, we found this barge a few years ago up on the beach in Rusting. Back in the 20s, they were having a great time. As I mentioned, that in the 50s, they had left because they thought bananas were no longer going to grow well because of a disease. But actually, some very intrepid local agronomists in Honduras were able to develop new varieties of bananas that are resistant. And so bananas have come back. This is why you now have Chiquita bananas or other bananas, because they were able to create new varieties. So this school, as I said, was located on the edge of this reserve, this wildlife reserve. In the 2000s, I had a whole series of students that went with me to study this North Coast region. Daniel Gonzalez, some of you may know, is now a biology professor at Andrews University. Rob Lovich at the bottom. He is the chief biologist for the Marine Corps at Camp Pendleton in Southern California. Jesse Bliss used to be at the School of Public Health. He's now in the National Environmental Center in Washington, D.C. Lee Greer, a lot of you know Lee Greer was a student. Several others, students that went to work with me trying to understand both the biology and the human history of this North Coast region. I'm just going to go through some pictures. Some of you may want to ask later questions about what we were doing and why we were doing it and so on. But I don't want to take too much time on this. It was a great experience. Now, based on that experience in Central America, and then particularly after Hurricane Mitch came to the region, I was asked by the State Department to come and join them. I went to Washington, D.C. from 1999 to 2003 and was working on hurricane disaster in important agricultural areas in Haiti and in Central America, but also in Mozambique and East Africa. And one of the outcomes of my work, not just mine, but my colleagues, but I was the chief manager of the project, was an acronym, a place called, an entity called the Mesoamerican and Caribbean Geospatial Alliance, MECGA. Okay, it's not MAGA, by the way. Okay, it's MECGA. And this alliance was supposed to bring together high technology, agricultural expertise, understanding of culture to help societies deal with the various kinds of problems that happen. And we used satellite monitoring to monitor things like dry season fires. We'll talk a little bit more about this because I think it's key to understanding the immigration crisis. If you look at this satellite image, you can see the really dark green areas. Those are the rainforest areas. And then you can see a lot of lighter colored areas where there's agriculture, and you can see all the plumes of smoke going up. This is typical of the dry season in much of this Central American region. We did analysis of agriculture and various things, created land use maps. You can go online later if you want to explore. There's a whole teaching module that is used in schools that deals with understanding this region, what is often called the Mesoamerican biocorridor. It's very important from an ecological perspective to understand it. Okay, now with that background, let me just get into the heart of the issue, and then we'll go to questions because I think it's important. Now, I hope some of you were able to read some of the articles that we sent, and particularly this first one, which was just updated a month ago by the Council on Foreign Relations. It's a good background to what's happening in Central America. We use the term Northern Triangle. It's in the news a lot, and we all assume that everyone's agreed with it. Actually, the three countries involved here, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, don't like the term because each of their cases is quite different. And in fact, a few months ago, if you remember when Vice President Harris went to Central America, she was criticized because she only went to Guatemala. And Guatemala, the president made a statement in saying he disavowed the term, this Northern Triangle, because he's not like Honduras or El Salvador. So each country is very proud of their history, but also very concerned that of how they're being portrayed. So let's try to see if we can, and other than that the three countries border each other, in a sense it makes a triangle, but there really is quite a different story. And again, this is my professor streak, a little bit of geography here to help us understand a little bit more. Some geographers refer to this whole region as Middle America or Mesoamerica. It's probably better than just calling it Central America or Mexico or whatever. But this particular diagram, I think, will help us to understand some of the dynamics. If you look at the different cultures and ethnic groups in the region, a really important distinction can be made between what I call the Rimland. This is all the Caribbean areas and this whole Atlantic coastal region. This is the region where the British, the Dutch, the French, others had colonies, or there were groups that had piracy. It goes back to the 1600s when the British pirates were attacking Spanish galleons to get the gold and so on. And of course, when the plantation system came to this region, sugarcane in places like Haiti and Central America, and eventually bananas. Initially, it was slave labor, and a lot of Africans were brought in. So this coastal region has a very strong African mixture, and there are also indigenous groups, and it has descendants of Dutch, of British, of French, of all kinds of people, including a small community of former Confederates that escaped the South after the end of the Civil War, and they went to live on the north coast of Honduras. They wanted to keep up with slavery, but then eventually they were forbidden from owning slaves. So it's an interesting, that Rimland is a quite distinct culture. The mainland, this is where the Spanish dominated, or where you had the indigenous peoples were led, and quite a different history and background. If you go to a typical mainland Spanish community, might be a mixed culture, speaking Spanish. Some cases might be a little bit of indigenous, the traditional layout of the community. You go to the coastal regions, and you find port cities built, of course, going back to the Banana Republic eras. You have the cultures that go back to Africa, including music like reggae music and things like that. So we're dealing with a region that really is quite diverse historically and demographically. Now, this is a question that I want to ask. Has collapse in ecosystems and civilizations happened before in this region? Archaeologists now show clearly that the Mayans and many of the others overexploited their environment. There were periods of severe climate stress. There was overexploitation. And so we know a lot more now about what not to do, okay, when you deal with these areas. There's some of you may have read this book. If you haven't, I encourage you to look at it, by Jared Diamond, called Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And one of the important ones that he talks about, of course, is the Mayans in Central America that were in Guatemala and in Mexico and even into part of Honduras. I have a link at the bottom here to something that's a really interesting thing. I'd encourage you to go listen to it later. This is a group that are trying to project 25, 30 years from now, and then looking back then and say, well, what happened in America? Why did we go wrong? Why did Western civilization collapse, and so on? So there's a lot of that kind of thinking these days, and it's interesting to look at. Now, one of the factors, of course, is climate change, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time about it. These are links that you can follow. We talked about this back in February, January and February. This is a very beautiful article that looks at the climate change as one of the drivers of people fleeing the region. If you remember Catherine Howe, she points out that climate change enhances the severity and the frequency of risks. It's not the only driver of problems in the region. But it definitely is a serious one. Just this last year, we had the worst late hurricanes in recorded history in the region. 2 hurricanes that were late in the season, but still very high intensity, produced a lot of damage. We talked more about this a few months ago. And that, of course, is still driving some of the immigration that we're seeing today. But there's also long-term environmental degradation that's going on. Many of the forests are being devegetated and turned into grassland for cattle. The cattle is shipped to Europe or United States. If you look at biological deterioration, particularly in biodiversity, it's the worst in Central America and Latin America of anywhere else in the world. And it's a really severe problem. Now, if we're going to truly understand what's driving a lot of this, we need to look at this map a little more closely. This is the Northern Triangle region. And you notice this area that is outlined. This is so-called the dry corridor of Central America. And this is the region where you have a very long dry season, even under normal situations. They depend very heavily on the rains coming on time. If they don't come on time, the corn and beans and other crops don't grow well, and then you have hunger. This is a region that periodically has problems with El Nino. El Nino brings problems. So this is a precarious place to live, even under, quotes, good times. When it gets bad, then it gets even worse. Now, if we look at the origin of the migrants, this is a map showing where most of the immigrants from Central America are coming from. It's important for us to understand that demographers tell us that migration tends to have a kind of a pattern to it that is important to understand. This is what we call the migration cycle. This means usually when people have hard times, if they're in a rural area, they first go to a small town. Maybe part of the family goes to the town, part of the family stays on the farm. They try to continue. They go from small cities to a bigger town, eventually end up in a shanty town in a big city. And then, of course, there they get involved with crime, drugs, gangs, other problems. They try to leave, and they eventually want to go to southern Mexico and eventually the US border. So migration has many different routes, many different causes. It tends to go in waves. And these are some of the articles that you can go back and read later that I think help to explain some of the complexities. Now, if you look at how it's changing, there's some interesting, I'm just going to pick a few things. You'll notice that Guatemala right now is, at least in up to 2018, the largest number of migrants are coming from Guatemala, secondarily from Honduras, and then El Salvador was quite high, but it's actually dropped down some. Another trend that is, I don't want to go through all the details of this, but another trend that's important to understand, that more and more of the migrants who are coming are coming with women and children, entire families, not just young men seeking work. Another thing that is actually quite a debatable issue is the migration that we're seeing now, is it worse than before? And actually it's increased again a little bit, but it's not near as bad as it was in the 1970s. So, looking at the migration curves, we need to kind of put a lot of this into context. Now, just a few points on Honduras and Guatemala and why it's different in each one, and then let's have some questions and answers. If you look at the Honduras part, you'll notice that most of the migrants are coming from these large cities in the north coast. And this is the richest part of the country. So why are they coming from there? Well, what's happened is that people have fled the false cities. They go to the coastal areas. They try to get work with the fruit companies, with the agricultural companies. This large dot is San Pedro Sula, which is the largest industrial area in Honduras. Many of those industries have been laying off workers because of mechanization. Agriculture, they're laying off workers. And so they first go from the farm, they try to get jobs, they can't get jobs, they emigrate. In Guatemala, it's really quite different. Most of the immigrants in Guatemala come from the highlands, and this is where the people traditionally live, on very small farms. And then the way they would make their living is that part of the family each year would migrate to the coast, where the big coffee plantations are, and they work as coffee pickers, work in sugar plantations, and so on. But unfortunately, I'm going to skip forward here a little bit. There's lots of different social and economic trends that are going on that are really driving people. There's an increasing gap between the rich and the poor. Some of the worst inequality gaps in the world are in these three countries. Here's a picture of a farmer trying to make a living on a small plot next door to a large area that's got condos. This is in the Bay Islands, and trying to, the side by side, the rich and the poor. Of course, there's a lot that's been happening. I have a picture here, if you can see where my cursor is, what the West End in Roatan used to look like in 1975. No hotels, white beaches, very, very, and then today filled with hotels and condos and so on. Technology, corporate profitability, a lot of different things are happening. In the rich agricultural lands, of course, the mechanization has driven out. Most of the people aren't used anymore. And so that is, of course, is a worldwide problem with export agriculture. Where do the people go if they can't get work? For them to farm, they have to go up into the mountains. They use shifting agriculture on steep slopes. It leads to erosion, to land degradation, increased poverty, and social inequality. Okay, you can see some of these rural farmsteads side by side. If you go to San Pedro Sula, or if you go to the Bay Islands, this was a wedding I attended just a few years ago of a very rich family in the Bay Islands who are now multimillionaires. Okay, a big driver right now is a new fungus disease that is really decimating the coffee crop in Central America. And so where people could work part of the year collecting coffee, that is less and less an option. And then, of course, we talk about El Nino and climate change. Here's just one picture so you can get this is in Guatemala. And this is what the typical landscape looks like in the highlands. Very small plots, people living in crowded areas. Okay, each generation subdivides the land into smaller and smaller pieces. They can't make a living, so the family has to try to find other ways to survive. Now, if you read the article, okay, that Dave sent out and some of the YouTubes, this one is particularly important. And this one, I think, it kind of describes the choice. Central America's choice: pray for rain or migrate. And there's a video embedded in that. I would encourage you to look at it. There's here just a few other articles that talks about what's happening. Now, of course, there are those that are trying to do things. Over the years, when I worked for the State Department, when I worked for ADRA, in a university, I worked with and as a Fulbright scholar, I worked with several organizations that are trying to help people in these very poor upland areas. We're looking at the left here. This is a small farm near Tegucigalpa, where ADRA, in conjunction with our Adventist hospital, is trying to teach better conservation agriculture. World Vision International, some of you may donate funds. I still donate funds each month to a family in Honduras that are helping a child go to school through the World Vision International. ADRA, of course, is involved, Mercy Corps. CGIAR, you might not know this term, but this is the Consultative Group on International Agriculture. This is the largest agricultural research group in the world. They used to be known as the Green Revolution Technology Groups, and they are still trying to do things in the countries. Now, a few words about El Salvador, and then let's open up for questions. Now, if you look at El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America. It's the most densely settled country. It doesn't have as many high mountains. Up till about 20 years ago, 90% or more of the land was owned by 15 families, okay? It was a land of very, very rich and a lot of poor people. It also then became industrialized. It's the heaviest industrialized country in Central America. A lot of the poor people moved to the cities to try to get jobs in this growing industrial sector. Of course, many of them could not get jobs. Many of them moved into gangs and into drugs and things of that nature. These are pictures just from a few years ago when I visited El Salvador. You see the traffic here in the capital city. This is visiting a national park with the principal of the Adventist Academy that's down there now. This Adventist Academy is working with Adventists at Andrews University. They want to turn it into a college. Now, that school, there in El Salvador, there are many schools that are run by Adventists. This is one of the Adventist schools that was established by my grandparents. They are trying to literally help the young people of the church escape poverty, escape gangs, escape drugs, figure out alternatives to a very, very dark situation. And of course, many of them emigrate to the United States. As I mentioned earlier, one of the attempts to try to deal with the problems, particularly for the youth of El Salvador, is they built the Adventist Academy. This is back in the 1980s. Up until the late 90s, my parents were there. My grandmother lived with them until she was in her 90s. And then this school, I went back for the 30th anniversary of the school. Many of the young people have become professionals. These are some of the former students of my parents at a memorial service that was held for them down there. Now, this academy has, one of its goals is to take the most troubled youth from the cities, take them to a rural environment, help to rehabilitate them. So it's more than just your typical academy, but it's a place to really to try to deal with troubled youth as well. It's a very big task. Now, there have been other things that are happened in the region. If you remember, in 1980s, late 80s, there was a major earthquake. Much of San Salvador was destroyed. There were many refugees. It also came at a time when the Civil War was pretty bad. In the bottom right here, you can see spray painted on this is a wall that was just around the corner from my parents' house. It says, aprendemos el uso de armas, vencer o morir. It said, let's learn to use arms, life or death, victory or death. Now, so Honduras, particularly El Salvador and others, have gone through discussions about whether revolutionary change is really the solution. Can US foreign aid help? Of course, during the Trump administration, they cut off all foreign aid to these three countries. It's been well, not all of it, but most of it. The Biden administration is now trying to rethink on what to do. It's a very, very difficult situation. If we have time, we could talk a little bit about Augusto Sandino. He is the father of what's called the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. This was back in the 20s. It was just a few hundred men, and they fought for over 10 years against the American Marines. I had about 10 or 15,000 Marines. This is one of those little wars that went on for a long time. The US was backing the dictator Somoza at the time in Nicaragua. And of course, a lot of Central Americans still remember that it was the Americans backed the dictator, they didn't back the people. So that's still a hot button issue in the region. But to me, I want to end with some of these pictures. These are the pictures that have shocked the world in the recent months. I'm sure if you were watching the news, you saw this. You've seen pictures like this at the border. And if you look closely at the pictures, you'll notice that many of these are indigenous people. They are not the higher class, whiter, upper class, Spanish speaking. These are indigenous people. Here's one of the ladies, one of the children that died trying to cross the border, getting a picture of her child. This is back in Guatemala. And this is a picture you can see every day along our border today. And I have a question. This is very similar to what my ancestors who came from Ireland, when they fled the Irish famine back in the 1800s, and they came to America, I asked, what's the difference? Is there a difference? They're fleeing hunger, they're fleeing warfare, they're fleeing corruption, they're fleeing ineffective government. So, and there's been a lot of discussion about caravans coming to Central America. I won't go into, you've seen it. But the question is, how should we as a public react? What should be or what is our foreign policy? How should the church react? And this is what I want to focus on. Let me just take a little drink of water here. When I used to take students to Central America over the years on trips, one of the places that I always went to and I was always inspired was on the coast of Guatemala, where there's an Adventist physician. He's deceased now, from what I understand, Dr. Solares. Dr. Solares was a good physician, and he actually became the Ministry of Health, the Minister of Health of one of the early governments back in the 1980s and 90s. I don't remember exactly the year, that was trying to do the right thing. They were going to try to deal with some of the gross inequalities, deal with land reform, deal with other things. The government got overthrown by a junta of landowners and others, very rich people. And he left the government and went to the coast to serve a small clinic and to build a small church near where a lot of these coffee pickers go each year. And on the top left, that's a typical little dormitory where a family would live in one of these rooms, just one room, where they would cook and sleep, and they're all together in that small room. They wash their clothes in the irrigation canal that goes through the coffee plantation. We had students from the School of Public Health with us, and we tested the water. This water is laced with all kinds of insecticides and pesticides. Many of the people who work in these agricultural occupations die early from various kinds of cancers traced back to pesticides. If you look at the three children here, to me, this is telling. And if you look at the picture, you'll notice the kid in the middle who's tall, and the one on the left, that's his brother, two kids, They both have shoes. They have good clothes. They actually speak Spanish. The little boy on the right in the red shirt, he's barefoot. This was at the Sabbath school at this Dr. Salado's clinic. He's actually older than the oldest kid, the tall kid here. He's been stunted since childhood from malnutrition, from generations of problems. And if you know a little bit of public health, he looks a little pot-bellied. Actually, some of that pot-bellied is because of vitamin deficiencies, but also caloric deficiencies. So what should we, as Christians, how do we deal with this immigration wave? Now, it's just beginning. We're told that this is going to get worse. This is just the beginning. How do we as a church respond? Now, last week, I mentioned a little bit in our discussion of CRT that whether it's dealing with governments or dealing with racism or dealing with poverty, among our Adventists, and this is where Ron Lawson, I think, might want to speak up in our discussion. There's a lot of differences between how different constituencies in our church look at these issues. If you're a lower class, poor person in Guatemala, but you're an Adventist, you look at things a lot different than if you're in a middle class or educated elite living in the city. Now, if you're a young person, you know, you look at it differently than the institutional leaders. Now, there are regional differences as well. As I mentioned, in the Bay Islands, which is the richest part of Honduras, many of the richest people are Adventists. They own ships, shipping companies, fruit companies, tourist hotels. Many of them backed the Contras against the Sandinistas and used their boats to ship arms to the Contras against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, of course, when the Sandinistas took over, they took over the Adventist Hospital. The Adventist Hospital was taken over by, and then the Cubans took over the hospital. If you talk to Guatemalans, indigenous people, or El Salvadoranians living in a gang that can't afford to go to the Adventist Academy, there's different views. So there are many different issues we could discuss: institutional issues, individual issues. What's the correct theological perspective? What's the historical perspective? So I'm going to stop there. And I think, let me just go back here a second. If some of you want to go to my website, or if you want to call me or send me an email, if you're upset at what I had to say or have questions, please feel free to contact me. And then we'll discuss. We'll take our break at this time. Rob, I think I'll at this point, I'll stop the share and go back to Forrest.
Oh, well, thank you, Bob. Thank you. And by the way, just thought I'd let you know that Bob has got a lot of smoke coming into his area today. So that's probably why his voice is cracking at times, but I'm glad you got that drink of water. We're going to take a 10, we're going to take a, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that this is the worst smoke I've ever seen here in Zion National Park. I woke up this morning and I can't even see the closest hill to me. So it's really quite bad. I apologize for my voice, but I'm sure the smoke has a lot to do with it. Okay, we'll see you. Yeah. Okay,
we're going to take a 10-minute break. I have 11:31 right now. So we'll come back at 11:41. If you have a question, please either raise your hand or, you know, through the, what do we call that? The reactions, you can raise your hand there or wave and maybe I can see you. Monte, I see you're here. Can you help me with that today? I'd appreciate it if you would. Anyway, so we'll take 10 minutes, we come back at 11:41.
Okay, I'm going to try to be a good guy like David and avoid talking during the break. So I'm going to not take any questions, then we'll wait. I'm going to go take a lozenge from my throat and drink some water, and we'll see you in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you, thank you. And by the way, we're gonna, okay, we are being recorded again. And Monte, you're on.
All right. So I've got a few people on the list. Those who aren't on the list, you can send me chats. I'll try to keep track of the chat too. But I'm going to take the first question for Bob, and that's, so you showed us some of the immigration numbers. I'm wondering how those compare to immigrants, people immigrating from Mexico, because I know when I was running a food pantry up in Angwin, a lot of our customers, in fact, a majority of them seem to be from Guatemala. I didn't feel like we had people from Mexico. And so I'm wondering what the kind of the comparison between those numbers are, proportions.
Actually, you're very right. The number of Mexican immigrants has been slowly declining over the years as things have gotten better in Mexico. And the highest number of immigrants from Central America are from Guatemala. And that's why in some of those pictures, and many of them are the indigenous peoples. Maybe a little background on Guatemala, a little bit more than what I said. Guatemala has about 15 distinct cultures and languages, indigenous peoples. Most of them don't speak Spanish or very little. Many of them don't go to school. And then the majority of the population are a large part of what are called Ladino. These are descendants of the Spanish. And if you go back in the history of Guatemala, Guatemala was one of the richest, shall we say, colonies of the Spanish Empire. And it was a transshipment point of gold that came from the Philippines, and then it would land and then cross in Guatemala, but also down in Panama. And so you've got a society that's very fragmented linguistically, ethnically, in terms of poverty. And then, of course, it's the heart of this dry zone that I was mentioning, that's very susceptible to a lot of the climate disasters. So there are many reasons why you'll see more Guatemalans than you will be anyone else.
Thank you. Okay, so I just want to let people know that I've gone. So I've got Forrest, then Roger, then Peter, then Sue. So let's go to Forrest.
No, tell you what, let Peter go first. I'll let some of the others go in there, then I'll come in.
Okay, well, we got Roger first, so let's have Roger come on in.
Oh, just some thoughts in listening to the presentation. The difference between a predicament and a problem. Problems have solutions, predicaments have outcomes. I'm wondering if that's kind of what we're dealing with, that we're beyond solving a problem. It's adaptation rather than mitigation. Secondly, I'm wondering if this is kind of the canary in the coal mine. When you look at what's happening in the western part of the United States, the Southwest, the water shortages that we're experiencing, the big droughts, the fires now, there are those who believe this could be just a perpetual problem here in the West and could cause mass migration at some point in time. The other thing that came to mind concerning the gangs and the drugs is our drug policy enhancing that problem. In other words, if we legalize marijuana or whatever, would we have the cartels that are creating the problems there? Those are just some issues that came to mind.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a very complex issue. I think McKinley very quickly said earlier, this is a complex issue. And I like your symbolism there of the canary in the coal mine, because this is what the specialists, if you read some of the articles that I listed, they're saying that this is just the first wave. This is the beginning. It's going to get worse. And because there are multiple problems, and some of them are long-term that will be with us, and you're absolutely right, we're going to have to deal with mitigation, not just, there's no solution. Some of the governments are trying to do their best. Guatemala is trying better than actually the others. There was a reason why Vice President Harris didn't go to El Salvador. Okay, El Salvador, of course, has got the biggest gang problem, and there's a history of collusion between some of the government and the gangs to the point that they are kind of embedded in it. And the current government is turned very sharp to the right. It's become kind of like the Hungarian and the Polish government. They are trying to silence a lot of the problems by muzzling the press, by putting people in jail, by things. And so the current governmental situation in El Salvador is really quite problematic. And that's one reason Vice President Harris didn't want to go there, shall we say, is trying to get the government to start to mend its ways in some of the issues that it's dealing with. I have no solutions. I mean, it's a little aside, which I think is, I'm trying to approach this, what is we as Adventists or Christians can do. 2 days ago, I follow on Facebook, there's an alumni group from the boarding school that my parents established in the country. There's also a very good, large youth group in Central America and in El Salvador. Probably the largest Pathfinder organization in our church, percentage-wise, in terms of number of youth that are involved in churches in the world, is in El Salvador. And one of the reasons and this is, my grandmother started Pathfinders. And you wonder, well, what does that have to do with this? Well, one of the reasons was to try to find alternative models, alternative approaches, alternative ways for young people, particularly in the teen years, to belong, to feel wanted, to feel important. The Inter-American Division had a camporee 2 or 3 years ago, just before COVID, and they were going to have one last year, but they had to cancel it. And it was the largest camporee in Latin America ever held by the Adventist Church. These are young people, and through me, those are some of the kind of things. It's not a solution, but it's trying to deal with it. I don't know if that helps, Roger.
Just one other thought. It seems to me the disparity between the rich and the poor, when you have big swaths of very productive land to raise pineapple that's consumed in North America by the rich, I mean, that land probably could be turned into smaller farms that would be very productive for farmers in the area. I don't know if that's a fact or not, but it just seems like a lot of the productive land is going to raise produce that's being exported to countries that can afford to have it imported.
Well, that's the classic definition of a banana republic. Okay, unfortunately, okay, now you raise, it's an interesting idea to throw out, but then as soon as you throw out the term land reform, okay, if you use the term land reform in any of these areas, particularly in those 3 countries, you immediately get a reaction from the political right who claim communist threat, communist this, communist that. And so one of the more difficult things that the US government tried to fund back in the Obama administration and back even under the Clinton administration was some forms of land subsidy, land reform that would be, and with loans for small farmers to improve agriculture. Those are the kind of things that I was doing when I was the State Department. But that small incremental approach is very hard to bring about when you have corrupt governments in charge and when you have, and so what's the solution? I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It seems, is it true that the farmers who farm are basically in hill country where irrigation is probably not possible, Whereas if it were in the lowlands with water access, they could irrigate and offset the
Oh,
drought.
yeah, absolutely. That's the case. If you remember that map, maybe I should bring it back up. The so-called dry zone, which is very, very large area of Honduras. This is where most of the poor people are. And these are the highlands. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of deforestation been going on over the last 150 years. A lot of the deforestation was to produce charcoal so they could run the railroads that would ship the bananas to the ports, okay? So this, and so you're dealing with, now you can see this worst case if you go to Haiti, okay, where, Haiti back in the 17 and 1800s was the richest French colony in the world. Okay. Today, Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And most of it, a lot of it has to do with devegetation, destruction, erosion in the hill country, where the people had to try to make a living, and then the beautiful lowlands, as owned by large landowners and for export agriculture. So, until we figure out, and of course it's getting worse because, as I mentioned, with mechanization and with container ships and all kinds of things, they don't need as many people to process the fruit either. So not fun, okay?
Okay, thank you, Roger. Let's go to Peter. And Donna, just to let you know, I have you at in the queue. I've added you. You're up, Peter. And you're unmuted, so we're ready to hear you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, for your presentation, and kudos for your family and for you for what you did for these people. I think they should build your statue there. I'm not kidding. I will try. I totally agree, and I'm not against these immigrants. I'm an immigrant myself and my family, and I am sympathizing with these people. And it's a very complex situation. And you presented the ecological factors that contributed to these problems, and of course, it's your specialty. And these are real factors, and especially the fact that they're losing a lot of land, the climate change, and it's a fight against nature to still preserve and not to lose too much land there. But I will try to look at a few more other factors in addition to the ecological factors. First of all, historically, Southern America, Latin and Southern America, and of course, including Central America, they got their independence from Spain about 200 years ago, after being about 300 years a Spanish colony. And I try to compare to understand that their situation in comparison with other countries. They got basically their independence around 1820s from Spain. At about the same time, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand got their independence from England. And I am looking at them and making a comparison. They are doing very well economically. All these three, Canada and Australia and New Zealand, they are industrial countries. They are very rich countries. And I'm looking also at South America and see that they have a lot of problems. Still, after 200 years of independence. And as you mentioned, I believe they are not lacking resources, economic resources. They have some resources. And I try to understand, to look at other factors that may be contributed to this poverty and all this migration problem. what about work ethics? And this in regard to Max Weber's book that he presented, The Ethics of Capitalism, the Spirit of Capitalism. And we know that the work ethics implies discipline and a balance in what we are doing. And could be also a small problem that will add to all these problems. Another problem could be the corruption. It's very prevalent in South America, and I'm talking about the whole continent of South America. Another factor could be that the economy is not very much diversified. The central government is encouraging some sectors of the economy, but not all sectors. And we have a disparity between some sectors doing well and others are disregarded, are not encouraged. And this could be also a contributing factor to the poverty.
Peter, could I have you stop there? Because I don't know if I can remember all of the things and we'll come back. No, you mentioned some important issues, but let me just pick on a couple of them. One about work ethic. In Central America, Salvadoranians are known for being the hardest workers in the region. There have been many different surveys. As I said, it's the most industrialized, most urbanized area. Very hardworking because they have to work hard to survive. Trying to be a small farmer under these conditions requires very hard work. So I don't particularly buy that particularly approach on terms of work ethic. I think we're dealing with bigger systemic issues than individual is. You also talked about the nature of capitalism. Now, last week, Dave mentioned, or someone mentioned a term which I think is appropriate here, vulture capitalism. Much of the capitalism that came to Latin America in the 1800s from the US, from Britain, from Denmark, from Holland and so on, the Dutch, was boom and bust cycles focused on fruit, on silver, on gold, there was boom and bust cycles and so on. And it was only the very rich that really benefited. And in terms of, comparing Canada with, say, Mexico, remember that Mexico, it's true, it got its independence in the 1820s from Spain, but all it did, and this happened also in Brazil, all it did is it transferred sovereignty from a rich king to a rich president or someone, corrupt in those areas. It took a revolution in the 1850s in Mexico to start to make some changes, if you study the history of Mexican independence, there was Zapata and there was and then it was the 1910 revolution in Mexico. It's taken 2 to 3 cycles of change, some of it very violent in Mexico, to bring about the change that is better. It's still not the best, but Mexico is doing better. Brazil, went through generations, after its independence of really and it's still dealing with a lot of things. So, the kind of governance that you see in Canada or Australia, where, you have people move into areas that were basically empty, a lot of rich lands, immigrants moving into lands. It was a totally different story than a region like Bolivia or Central America or Mexico that had been a colony of a big empire for the last 500 years. And I don't want to oversimplify, but I think, like Dave was saying last week, and this is kind of personal to me, we can't feel guilty personally about all the bad things that have happened, but I think we need to learn from the past, learn what went wrong, what isn't working, and we need to take responsibility. I'm always amazed when I go back to Central America and I find the young people who are struggling to get an education, and eventually some of them come to the States or go to Europe or whatever. The same kind of hard work, desire to improve themselves, you'll find it. But you'll find many, many young people or many of the elders that have given up, and they're completely overwhelmed by a very complex situation that makes it difficult to succeed. That doesn't mean that, we're not going to get utopia in Central America, but we can improve things. And I think there are things on the governmental side that can be done. There are things that we as individuals can do. There are things that the church can do. I wish I had the solutions, but they're not all there. Thank you.
I might add a few other things that contribute to the lack of more progress. One will be the instability of governments.
Mhm.
Well, in South America, the governments are not very stable, and they are changing quite often, and this could be an important factor that it's not contributing to more progress.
Yeah, let me just stop you there a minute. I would be very careful about just using the general term South America. When we use the term South America, remember that's a whole continent.
Yes.
Okay. Central America is another region. All of the countries vary. Today, the most stable, peace-loving country in the world, listed under countries that look at it in terms of good governance, is Costa Rica. It's in the region. There are countries in South America, like Chile, that are doing not bad. So I would try to avoid overgeneralizing to a whole region. Let's look at, even if you look in Central America, as I say, the current government in Guatemala is actually quite effective and is doing better. The government in El Salvador is not. Unless we take the time to understand the differences, we're not going to really understand or be very helpful. So I don't want to be too hard on you, but be careful about overgeneralizing to the whole, everything south of the border being a problem. Mm.
Well, yes, I agree with you that the situation should be examined from country to country. And you mentioned Chile. Well, Chile, it's a very interesting example because it started doing very well after Augusto Pinochet came in power, and he was more than 20 years in power there. He was a general dictator, and politically, of course, a lot of problems, people disappearing and put in prison. But economically, he was doing very well, and Chile is still doing after he was he himself gave up power, and they're doing still very well with the model that he created there economically.
And I beg to disagree there. I was in Chile several times. The Pinochet government was one of the bloodiest dictatorships in Latin America.
This is what I said. I just said.
Okay, yeah, okay. But because they improved somewhat and economically, he did it primarily by being in collusion with the large chemical companies that were mining in the country. If you follow the history of Chile since then, there have been better governments and some that are a little bit worse. But it's again, we're overgeneralizing if we pick on a country, and particularly on a dictator, just because he made the banks work or the railroads run or the rich people get richer, doesn't mean it was good governance in my view.
Well, the index of poverty and the middle class increased during Pinochet.
Yes, it did, and it did in other countries as well, but it didn't because, and I really don't think this is a productive discussion, Peter. I think we need to be a little bit more nuanced. And I'd like to maybe hear from some of the others about particularly what we as a church, how we should relate to these institutional issues.
Okay, well, I had some other things to mention, but you want to hear from others.
Okay. So I want to mention that I have John Ney on the chat, which some can look at. I'll just add John to the queue and we'll bring his comment in a little later. So Sue, you are up next in the queue.
Okay, a few questions. I put myself in the place of somebody who's poor in Guatemala, El Salvador, etc. Especially El Salvador, if the government is supporting the huge drug cartels there and murdering people on the street. And I think, okay, there's an Adventist school over here. I'll send my kids to the Adventist school. But you mentioned they usually leave, or often leave, sometimes leave, I don't want to misquote you, to the US or to Europe. But what's the future for them there in their country? You know, I mean, we're educating them, and we're giving them a better life, but so they can get out of their country. And I'm thinking they don't really want to leave their country, but they feel they have to in order to save their own lives and their families' lives. So what else can the church do? I'm looking at the people who do make it through the horrific journey to come here. And I see on the news a lot of Catholic people helping, etc. The refugees, you know, giving them food and shelter until they can present their case to the courts. And I'm thinking, wouldn't it be nice to see some Adventist groups there? You know, are we doing anything at the border?
Well, actually, Sue, you raised a very interesting question. And again, not all of these immigrants are in the same category. You know, as I said, the large number of Guatemalans, many of them are these poor indigenous peoples that are no longer can make a living by going to pick coffee and so on in the drought. And there are actually Adventists, we don't hear much about it, I wish we did, but in some of the churches along the border that have been collaborating with other community groups in terms of providing food, soup kitchens and things like that. Now, ADRA, I mentioned ADRA has tried for years and actually has done some very good projects in some of these countries dealing with agriculture, reforestation, with preparing for disaster mitigation, training church members. The churches in El Salvador and Honduras have very active community service groups that deal with, you know, what to do when there's a earthquake or hurricane, or, you know, these are the kind of things that are increasing. So community service, ADRA type work is very, very active. I wish we heard more about it. Maybe we should sometime, this is a suggestion to the Branson class. It would be nice to have our ADRA representatives that work in Latin America come and talk a little bit about some of the things they're doing. Now, about the kids getting an education and then having to leave. Ask you a question. This is a rhetorical question. What are the two largest cities where Salvadoranians live that it's not San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador? Anyone know which ones they are? Okay, it's Los Angeles and Fairfax, Virginia. Okay.
There was something up in the east.
Fairfax, Virginia and the surrounding DC suburbs has over 400,000 Salvadoranians that they've come over the last 20 or 30 years, some of them from the early Civil War eras, later from the gangs. You know, it's been various waves. A lot of them were the best educated. and have done very well. You go to Los Angeles and some of the suburbs, very large numbers of Salvadoranians. Some of them, many of them came under what's called temporary protective status. This gets into the legal aspects of immigration, but temporary protective status was given to thousands of Salvadoranians, particularly after the Civil War, during the Civil War, people that were in fear of their life during the period there. And of course, their families, some have done well. Many of the young people that go to our schools in El Salvador, if we look, and particularly the academy, and go on to college, most of them, if they want to have an Adventist education, they have to go to Costa Rica, where it has the only Adventist university in Central America. It's a very good school, but it's getting more expensive. It's hard for them to go. The largest number of students in the university from one country is from El Salvador, and they go to Costa Rica. And then from there, they go into medicine. Many of them go to Monte, go into medicine. I was just talking with one the other day. He's a Honduranian, just finished medical school in Monte, and he can't go back to Honduras. And so he's actually starting a practice in Chihuahua, Mexico as a radiologist. This is sad, but a lot of the brightest and the best and trains go elsewhere. When my parents came to Loma Linda, they stayed in Central America 15 years after they, quotes, retired, and then they eventually came to Loma Linda, and they helped found the Loma Linda Spanish church. Okay, many of you in Loma Linda have probably driven by it or didn't even realize that there's a very large Spanish church there. It used to be a gym. It's down there. It's one of the shopping centers there. Some of you, I'm sure, know where it is. That Spanish church has a large number of former students, former colleagues from Central America, including former pastors that had to flee, that are now living in the United States. What to say? Many of them have done very well, and they are serving. But that we mainly hear about the uneducated, poor, landless, indigenous Guatemalan at the border. We don't hear about those who come in, with maybe a temporary visa, and then they overstay their visa, they get a job. And of course, our whole economic system is set up right now that if you are a good worker, I dare say if you went through and look at a lot of the nursing staff at Loma Linda, particularly and at the housing staff, you might find there's a lot of former Adventists from Central America that are running the housekeeping at Loma Linda University. And some of them, I dare say, probably are illegal as well, if you want to use that term. But they're doing a good job. So how do we solve this? Is there a solution? What do you think, Sue?
Well, I don't claim to have any or all the answers because I'm just learning about this, but it bothered me the other day on NPR. I heard a gentleman talking to an interviewer, and he said, the US backs terrible dictators and causes a lot of the problems because they are in collusion with the drug cartels.
Right.
And he said, please excuse my anger. He didn't sound real angry, but you could tell it was a white heat anger. He's just really very angry at the hypocrisy of the United States, saying you can't come here when they were contributing greatly to the problem. And I'm thinking, okay, and Adventists, I feel like Adventists just want to blow it off as all those people, they want to come and ruin our country. So is there anything the Adventist church can do to educate both Adventists and also make a plea to the government? Let's be ethical with who we back.
Okay, well, this brings up a question that came up last week in our discussion when we're talking about CRT theory. How traditionally, how has the church dealt with political issues? Not individual beliefs or being a good servant or welcoming the homeless in your house and so on. How do we deal with politics? Okay, and I wish Dave was here, or maybe and some other theologian, but we've been admonished, stay out of politics. Ellen G. White said we should not be in bed with labor unions. By the way, one of the best sources of help in a lot of these countries are labor unions. And the Adventist Church has not worked with labor unions in terms of dealing with workers in these chemical plants or in the fruit plants and things like that. So we say, don't get involved with politics, but at the same time, when the government is corrupt and it does things and it kills people, we stay quiet because we don't want the government to take over our church or our school or our hospital. Now, this is where the institutional aspects get into play. Maybe Ron Lawson will have something to say about this, but how we react as an institutional entity to corruption, to malfeasance, to bad governance, to these things. Do we speak out? But can we do it in a way that's non-political? I don't know. It's a quandary.
Well, I'm thinking it's maybe better to speak out to the United States politicians than the local ones, because you don't want your hospital taken away from you. But yet, are we still backing corrupt dictators in that region? And if so, let's, as a church organization, why don't we make a statement? I mean, we see the Pope making statements all the time, and we think, oh, he's evil, anything he's connected with climate change, anything, that's an evil conference they're going to have. And I'm thinking,
right, yeah, well, but this is where this kind of came up last week a little bit. How should the church relate to things like that are not just economically bad policy or bad governance, but things that are racist? We weren't going to get into this week, but maybe some other week. In Rwanda, I was the academic dean at the Adventist University, and we started with 25 students, and now up to 7,000 students. We were there before the genocide, and then after the genocide, I went back to work at the National University. It turned out that several of our Adventist leaders were indicted by the International Criminal Courts for getting involved with the genocide that occurred in Rwanda. Right now, we are supporting the dictator in Rwanda because, quote, he brought peace, and because the government actually donated land so that we can build a new medical school that Loma Linda is doing in Rwanda, okay? With that government, the Rwandese government is known as, shall we say, a benign dictator. He's doing some good things, but he's also doing some very bad things. Should we be speaking out? Should we be doing a joint agreement with a government that has blood on its hands just so we can have a medical school in Central Africa? I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm just, there's just a lot of questions and issues. I can understand why Ted Wilson and other leaders, try to thread the needle, to avoid saying things that will disrupt, but, what is the answer? I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go over my list just so people know I haven't forgotten you, and you can let me know if I have. I've got Forrest, Donna, Ron, then chats from Ellen and John, and then Rodney Corker, and I see that McKinley is just joined the list. So let's go to Forrest.
No, go on to Donna.
All right, on to Donna.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, I wanted to, I tuned in a little bit late this morning, but I want to thank you very, very much for this survey of the comparison and contrast among the different countries in South and Central America. We tend, I think, to think of them as sort of a monolithic entity, and they're not, and it's very helpful to sort these out. second thing, it seems you asked about the difference between the Irish and the people coming in now over the border. A couple of things. I think one, of course, the Irish are white. Second, the Irish were English speaking. And because they were English speaking, they were more easily absorbed into the population that was already here. The differences, the ways in which they are like the South American and Central American immigrants is that they are Catholic, but what could I say? The salvation
They're brown.
is began to have smaller families, and to me, ultimately, the real solution to this problem is because it would not be the press, the duress, and the difficulty if the families were smaller. But when you have, 10 or 15 or even 7 or 8 children, the need to feed people is great. And one of the great things about Protestantism, and in fact, something that Adventists can do, is to pass out condoms or birth control pills, because it seems to me that is probably the single most helpful thing that not only the United States, but the Adventist Church can do. I have a friend who some of you know, was a missionary in Africa when the AIDS epidemic began, and he was giving out condoms and was supported by the church because he viewed as encouraging promiscuity. And I think the advantage is to encourage all our families. That doesn't address the immediate issue of what we should do about the people coming across the border, but it is, I think, an ultimate solution. That's all.
Very good. You bring up a very good point. Again, it's helpful to look at different countries and different parts of the countries. It's interesting that one of the major success stories that the US government was doing under the Clinton administration, and later actually under the Bush administration as well, because I worked under both, was in family planning in Central America. And it was quite successful, although family planning usually works best around the world. They have found when you combine it with other healthcare, primary healthcare improvements. And the healthcare system in El Salvador, for instance, is really quite good, even down to the community health center level. And the idea that most families in Central America now still are having 10 or 15 kids is really no longer the case. There's been quite a significant drop in the average birth rate per woman in several of these countries, particularly in El Salvador and Costa. So I mean, it's all obviously good family planning, good health care, good community health care. All of those are parts of good governance. And the story varies from one country to the other. If you go to South America, one of the countries with the best records of dealing with family planning is Uruguay. So, it's again, but it's definitely an issue. But it's more than just a number of children.
Thank you. Sorry, we're going to lose you. We're driving, but thank you again very much for.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. Ron, you're up. Ron Lawson.
Thank you. Bob, I've got 3 different sorts of questions which have gradually accumulated. One is quite different, but your beginning provoked it. As I've worked on different countries of the world and Adventism, I've noticed that there's considerable difference depending on who the missionaries were.
Right.
And that very often missionaries were very conservative, Adventist-wise, and established churches in their own image. But the images were somewhat different from one country to another. So what they would put their emphasis on varied. I was wondering what sort of legacy the Fords left, and how that would compare. I mean, I knew your father, and I know you, and I'm curious to know how they would compare with what. So what in other words is the legacy in El Salvador and in Honduras of what they did church-wise. Secondly, I did a study based on the 2000 and 2010 censuses in Mexico. The Mexican census is the most detailed of any in the world that I've been able to find, that included that related religion to all sorts of other things. And I compared Adventists with Mormons and with witnesses, as I have often done. And I was really astonished in Mexico to find that Adventists were much poorer than the witnesses, and certainly a whole lot poorer than the Mormons, who were pretty well off. They just simply don't keep their poor people. They leave. On the other hand, Adventism is centered in the South, in the mountains, among the very poor people. And we're not centered on particularly on the city and on the north, the way the Mormons and the witnesses to a lesser extent are. So I was interested in how that profile would compare with the profile in other Central American countries.
Ron, could I just deal with those first and then get to your last question?
Certainly.
On the legacy of my grandparents, particularly in Central America, as I said, their goal, my grandfather's goal, was to build a new church every year, establish a new church, and many different schools. And he did start a new company of some kind in terms of evangelism and so on. But he focused very heavily on education, as did my parents. And I think that has, and Pathfinders, you wouldn't think of it, but Pathfinders has had a huge impact in terms of dealing with the young people and community services. So the fact that they are active, they're helping, they're doing a lot, I think is an important legacy to really look at in that regard. In terms of who, comparing the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, and the Adventists, and in Central America, it's really an interesting story. I think you're absolutely right that Adventism, particularly in Mexico, is centered in the southern mountains among the poorest indigenous peoples. The same happened in Guatemala. Most of the Adventists are in the indigenous peoples in those highland areas among the poor. Remember, I was talking about the doctor who went to work among the farm workers and so on. One of the big debates that occurred, and I mentioned this last week, when the Central American Union moved its offices from Guatemala City to Costa Rica under Bob Falkenberg, who eventually became our General Conference president. The major reason that they did it was because they felt more safe and protected in a, quotes, more democratic country. But one of the major reasons, a lot of the indigenous Adventists who were among the poorer classes felt that the church was abandoning them to the juntas and to the right-wing groups in Guatemala. And they felt left out. And to this day, there's a lot of anger among Adventists who felt that the union left rather than standing up for them. I don't know if that helps to put the situation. The same now in Honduras, it really is a different tale of two cities. You go to the Bay Islands on the North Coast, which is the richest part of the country. That's where Adventism started, okay? And the major ship owners, the major tourist hotels owners are all Adventists. The largest supermarket chain in the Bay Islands is owned by Adventists. But they tend to be very supportive of right-wing causes. A lot of them have dual citizenship now, live in the US and also down there. Many of them supported the Contras fighting the Sandinistas who were trying to bring and so on. So you have a part of Adventism that is very much allied with the rich and so on. But then most of the Honduran Adventists that are on the mainland, that are these poor people that are either trying to eke out existence on a degraded hillside or trying to work in an industrial farm or an industrial in San Pedro Sula. And they barely speak Spanish. They don't speak English. They don't do well. And so there's really a big divide, politically speaking, between those poor Adventists and the rich Adventists. I don't know if this helps to point out some of the issues. Then you had one other question as well, Ron.
Yes, thank you. Most interesting. I can fill you. I want to say a bit more about Guatemala and the unions move. But before that, two political comments and a question. When I was in Nicaragua, I was there, I think it was, it was very much at the beginning of the Sandinista period. And the hospital had fallen. We'd sort of given it away. We couldn't get missionaries to staff it under the Sandinistas, and that's what happened to that hospital. And the president of the union was unusually a Nicaraguan, a black-skinned Nicaraguan, who was very supportive in himself of the Sandinistas, and was trying to persuade gently church members to work with the government, because there was opportunity at the local level to do that under the Sandinistas at that time. I was wondering how that turned out afterwards, because I don't know what happened afterwards. The concerning Guatemala, I interviewed Valkenburg. He'd already left when I got there, but I interviewed him later, and he was very proud, astonishingly proud, of his relationship with the president, the military dictator, who was at the time apparently the one who was considered the most bloody of all of them. Valkenburg was proud that he had such a close relationship with the president that he could visit him in the presidential mansion, and that when he left, he was the first Protestant to be given a state farewell, right, again in the presidential mansion.
Right. I know that story.
And if I can go just one step further, and the other thing that I found out was that when I got there, I was just amazed, because it was a mission. It wasn't even a conference. And it had this amazing building and in one of the best parts of Guatemala City. Right. And it turned out to have been the union headquarters. Right. And it had been built in this really identifying with the rich, there. And apparently one of the things that triggered the decision to move was that they were the majority of the people were poor people, of course. The people who lived in Guatemala City, the Adventists, were largely people who lived in the hovels on the sides of the volcano, and they really resented the identification of the church with the wealthy and with the junta. And apparently the union received a threat of violence.
Yeah.
And they took it, they decided that it was a threat from Adventists who were angry with them. And they took it so seriously that they packed up and left in great haste. That was the story I heard when I was there.
Yeah, no, that definitely happened. For full disclosure, I should mention that I've known Bob Falkenberg for a long time. Until his death, he and I were Facebook friends, and we used to communicate a lot. He's actually a relative. He's a second cousin, first cousin of my dad. He was a very interesting man. He was the mission president in Honduras when we were there. Then he eventually went to as I said, to the Union, then to the Inter-American Division, then the General Conference. He was a pilot. He flew around in a small airplane, and he used to take a lot of us on joyrides. I remember going on joyrides. My first time in a small airplane was with Bob Falkenberg. And he loved taking up friends. He was, I want to, when I say this, I'm saying it in hopefully in a loving, kind way. He was one of these people that was a glad hander. There was nobody, everybody was his friend. He loved to talk and meet people. He was great at, interacting. I'm sure some of you have had bosses or presidents or people like that. Very charismatic, very open. He truly believed that he was the kind of person that could talk, could sell an Eskimo, maybe, a heater or something. He was a really interesting, nice guy. And so, but he had this reputation of, going for, he would immediately, you get into a crowd and he would find out who was the richest, who was the person in charge. He could talk to anybody. He could talk to any president. He did a lot of good, but you're absolutely right that there was a lot of Adventists that really resented his leadership, and that's why it moved. I'm sure that the threats were real, and he did what he thought was the best thing. Was it the best decision? No, we weren't in his shoes. We weren't there. These kind of things happen. I look back at my career back in Rwanda when I was the academic dean of our new university. We were seeking accreditation. I had to work with the Ministry of Education, the Minister of Education, and the President Habyarimana. He was the one that was shot down that started the genocide in Rwanda. His Minister of Education was eventually put in prison with the International Criminal Courts for the genocide. He was the guy I was working with across the desk for months to get our school accreditation. I worked with the government. As I look back, should I feel guilty about the fact that I talked and worked with a government official that turned out to be a genocider? Now, this is one of the things that I will carry to my grave. Should Bob Falkenberg, if he was still alive, should he feel bad because he was a good friends with the president, who was also a dictator? Okay, I'm just throwing it out as an answer. Maybe some of you have, maybe Rob, you have the answer. What is the answer to that?
I don't think I have. I just am good at raising questions and not coming up with answers.
Yeah, it's a tough one, yeah. Anyway, there's still several hands up, and I think we're also already over our time for us. So, but I see Rod, Eduardo, and McKinley. I see their hands raised.
Could you go to one?
Yes, I can keep going. I
Okay,
know it's
we'll double your wage. So, okay. All right, Monte, back to you. Get these other hands that are up, and then.
Okay, we'll stop with officially, maybe with Eduardo.
Yes, that would be good.
So I'm going to just point out that Ellen, I'm going to go to these messages on chat. They're next in line, just in case people aren't tuned into that. So Ellen said, it seems to me that we should be training young people for the medical work. And John May said, even aside from the accusations of quote unquote communism, etc., that accompany land reform, one must also keep in mind that breaking up farms that grow export crops so small farmers can have the land, it also can undermine a country's currency and economy due to the loss of exports. Zimbabwe suffered that problem, among others, obviously, not only Rwanda. So just some thoughts there shared via chat. And next I have Rodney. Did Rodney leave us?
I think he's left us.
I think we just left him because I checked that a few minutes ago. Unfortunately, we missed Rodney. So then after Rodney, I've got McKinley.
Thank you, Monte, and thank you, Dr. Ford, for your presentation. So as I mentioned at the beginning, at some point, that the problem you covered is a complex one, encompassing many factors: political, socio-economic, environmental, and maybe even some cultural challenges. But I think migration as a solution seems to be temporary in nature because it doesn't address the problem long term.
Yellow shirt.
For these endemic challenges, because whole populations, I think you agree, as with many, can't migrate to other countries. So what should be done? I think you being a USAID person will appreciate that many migrant residents in the US send a lot of remittances back to their countries. So for example, to El Salvador in 2019, the 2 million or so El Salvadorans in the US sent back about $6 billion, which represented about 23% of the El Salvadoran GDP. Guatemalans sent back about $10 billion. Hondurans sent back about $5.2 billion. So I'm wondering, as a kind of a different approach, could USAID work with those governments to find a way to harness some of those remittances and redeploy them in a more targeted way that can help create some employment situations that could potentially stem the flow of a migration, or not create the conditions that would trigger these people migrating to places that they may not necessarily want to go. So that's the first question, and then I'll have another comment.
Yeah, let's on the remittances, you're absolutely right there, McKinley. I saw the same thing in Haiti. Haiti would collapse tomorrow if it wasn't for the remittances that go back from Haitians in the United States and around the world. The same in several of these countries. A very large part of their funds, but of course, most of this goes to families. Some of it goes to small groups or churches, things like that. So that's always a help. At USAID, when I was there under the Clinton administration, the first 2 years I was with them, we actually had a fairly strong program to try to improve the way money is sent from people in the US to family down there, because one of the problems is that trying to transfer money, can be, if it's done through corrupt or shall we say, what's money lenders and so on, it doesn't necessarily, a lot of it gets siphoned off. But one of the things that we did try to do was to create mechanisms so that people could join their remittances together to produce some more community-based functions. It was an interesting project. It got started. Unfortunately, under the Bush administration, they stopped it for a couple of years, and then they tried to restart it. And by then I was gone, so I don't know what happened to it. But you're absolutely right that trying to figure out how to link together the people that are in the diaspora, the people that are living abroad, to their family back in these countries is one of the most effective things that could be done. I understand that the Biden administration is trying to rethink that and to come up with suggestions. The Trump administration, of course, stopped almost all of their funds and that was going to these countries for various reasons, various things. I don't want to get into that. That was a kind of a difficult period. But you're right. You know, it's an important area. Thank you for bringing that, McKinley.
Yeah, thank you for the feedback there, because I think, you know, as you know, with multiplier effects and the way that money can be leveraged, sometimes 3 times to up to 10 times, $20 billion could potentially have an economic impact of 60 to what is that, $200 billion, which would be, which could have some significant benefits to those economies, making it not too necessary for people to undertake those very difficult and dangerous journeys. Now, the other question that you asked, which is very important, is what could the Adventist Church do? And I think one way to look at that is what can or should a Christian's response be when a fellow human falls on hard times, if we think about the immigrants that way? And I think the texts that Forrest read at the beginning of the class suggests an empathetic response is advisable. And then the question is, you know, what can we do materially? And I think the story of the Good Samaritan is instructive. But then one has to be positioned with material resources to act. And I think this is where Adventist education can provide a possible pathway on a couple of levels. First, position Adventists in better performing economic societies to act in ways like Dr. Suarez, I think is his name in the presentation.
Yeah,
and
Salado.
Yes. And then some of the volunteers that were shown in your slide. I'm reminded of a Canadian who went to Africa, I think in the 80s or so. He was a millionaire and he went about building several schools across the continent. I think as the economies transition in the developed countries, if Adventist Christians were positioned to be more materially equipped, perhaps they could undertake some of those types of activities, which would then improve conditions locally. And I think as such people help educate the folks locally, combined with, say, the remittance leveraging, one could potentially see a path to changing some of the conditions on the ground that could affect the migration patterns.
Okay, on the one more thing on the remittances, that what you were talking about is exactly what the USAID project was trying to do. It was trying to create mechanisms where families and friends from America could join their funds together in projects on the ground that would be maybe an agricultural or a health project or a school project or paying for a school teacher, things of that nature, but to create the infrastructure, the linkages, so it could be done safely without the money being lost, and so there'd be good accountability. You know, and it was actually, it worked for a while, but as I said, it kind of got lost in the process there.
That's too bad, because it would seem to be a very effective tool in responding to this, the challenge of both the conditions on the ground and then the conditions that trigger folks undertaking these very dangerous journeys.
Okay, now on the other issue, there's actually a group that I've been involved with that is trying, as I mentioned, that the academy in El Salvador that my parents founded with funds from USAID, by the way, at the time, this was in the early 1980s, USAID gave a large amount of money to help build buy the land and build the academy. The director of aid at the time was an Adventist. He's now retired at Southern Adventist University in Chattanooga. He lives there, very, very good gentleman. That school has been growing. It has great infrastructure. It has lots of land. It has, there is a group of physicians and donors and others that are back at Andrews University have formed a consortium to turn that school into the second university. Because as I mentioned earlier, part of the problem has been that a lot of the Adventist youth that want to go on from high school have to go to Costa Rica. It's costly, it's expensive, it's a long ways away. And so they are actually, because of the pandemic, they've put it off, but this consortia based out of Andrews is already put together several $1 million to build an annex and to turn the school there in El Salvador into a college. And it would be both a vocational technical college, a kind of a polytechnic type of school that would be job focused, but it would also have a career focused pre-med, pre-law education, things like that. No, they were gonna launch it back in the end of 2019. Then the pandemic came along, and we all know what happened. So it's been put on hold. But this group, I think, has a good idea, and I think it's something that at least I am going to support. They've asked me if I would actually be willing to go back to El Salvador and spend some time with them launching this university. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
Okay, next up and final on our list is Eduardo.
Thank you, Robert. I'm gonna try to ask you a question, and maybe you can change my mind. Let me tell you, I'll turn 61 this month. My first 12 years of life, I grew up in the country. And I grew up thinking that there was no evil people around my life. Then, because my mom's sickness, we moved to the city, and then I did another 6 years in school in the city, the second biggest city of Mexico, Guadalajara. I remember going to the movies on Sunday, coming after 11 o'clock with no bus. I have to walk home, and I have no fears of violence. Mexicans used to have two phrases: México lindo y querido, beautiful Mexico. And the other one is, como México no hay dos. Like Mexico, there is not another one. And I thought that we were very nice, peaceful people. Then my mind started changing when I started listening to the cartels in Colombia.
Right.
Crossing Mexico, bringing all the drugs, the violence. And then when I was in high school, I started listening to the violence in Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. And I think that these migration of people from Middle America and South America was bringing all these violence. I don't think that it was any economic crisis in those areas. I think it was violence and drugs that make people migrate to the north. And many of them learn to kill, learn to steal. And what do you think? I'm thinking that the economic crisis was nothing to do with the migration in those years.
Well, you've raised several interesting points there. the drugs issue is definitely a problem. And we should all remember that there would not be a drug trade unless there were people buying the drugs. And then most of that is in the United States. So we've got something to do with it. In terms of, how do you deal with that, with the cartels? What was interesting, I can just a little story that maybe it highlights. I went back a few years ago to where I grew up in the Bay Islands in a little town of French Harbor. This was where the first Adventist church was built, Indian American Division. Very nice little place. And I was commenting to the pastor who was filling in there at the time. And they had me staying with a church member in a building that I grew up in as a child. So it was kind of going back home. And I was asking, well, who owns these beautiful Arabian horses next door? I said, I didn't know they had horses in Roatan. And then he kind of hem and hawed, and he said, yeah, aren't those beautiful Arabian horses? And they were in this corral built right in the center of this little village, right next to the Adventist church. And then I said, well, who is this guy? Well, they said, this is so-and-so. They gave me his name. Well, what's he doing with horses? Well, he says, turns out he was one of the drug runners, okay, the major drug runners bringing, and the way he made his money, lots of money, is that he would go out and meet the drug running ships that came from the cartels in Venezuela and Colombia. They come up along the coast, and then they would stop out, 10 miles off coast, and then he would come out and bring them water and food and other things. And basically he was the supply chain for all the drug runners going through there. And so he bought Arabian horses, and that's partly how he spent his money. But he was also involved in these issues. So it can be very close and very personal in many different ways. One other little fact, I think a lot of us forget this. Remember, under the Obama administration, Obama was constantly harangued by people on the left for being remember, he was called a deporter in chief for a while, because until Trump came along, he had deported more people back to Central America than any president. Most of those that he deported back were those with criminal records, many of those from Los Angeles and from Fairfax, Virginia, and places like that, who were involved in the gangs and the drugs. They were sent back to Central America, and of course, they could never come back to the US. So they go back, and then they just exacerbate the local problem, because they didn't have a mechanism. The government couldn't deal with all of these. There was, at one point during the administration, the Obama administration, that they were sending 100 to 200 people a day by airplane that were gang members from Central America, from the US, sending them back to El Salvador. They would give them 1 day's amount of food, drop them at the airport and say, goodbye, I hope you just stop misbehaving. And that was basically it. Again, it's a complex story about what to do.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I have just, I know we're running out of time, but these are not so much questions that I have so much, but my wife went to Honduras right after she graduated from nursing school to do a mission trip, and which was about 15 years ago. Anyway, she said she'd go down there and people were carrying water on their backs, and there were wells 10 meters away, fenced off, because of the fruit companies needed that water for the bananas or whatever. There's a real problem that we've had as Americans with them for years. Secondly, as you ask about the Irish, I'm half Irish. My mother was Sullivan. And they said that God caused the blight, but Victoria caused the famine. And I think it was poor management. There was plenty of food in Ireland, but they just wouldn't give it to the Irish. So anyway, and then finally, what impact does weather have on the impact of workers? Does it really slow their productivity down in Central America?
Oh, absolutely. You know, and one of the articles that Dave put on there, the one that talked about, you know, pray for rain or migrate.
Yeah.
There's a little video embedded in that. I encourage all of you to go listen to it.
Okay.
And it talks about the fact, it interviews various farmers. You know, my background and my specialty is really in agricultural geography. And what happens in this dry zone in Central America is that life is very precarious. It depends on the rains coming on time. If it's 2 weeks late or 3 weeks late, and one of the farmers in this little video, he said that they've had to stop growing beans because they have to plant beans 2 or 3 weeks earlier than the corn. As you know, the traditional crops in these highland areas, there's corn, beans, and squash kind of mixed together in a very ecologically pretty good system. But when the rains come late, okay, once in a while they do come. No, it happens because of El Niños. You'll have a bad year maybe once every 5 years or every 10 years. But when it happens all the time or every other year, and then the rains come late, they're only able to grow corn, and then not enough corn to even survive. And then they have to start, you know, and so it really is a situation, particularly in this dry zone, of very unpredictable weather, of course. And then, of course, you add on top of that poor governance, crime, drugs, you know, and then you have really a very bad situation. So these people would probably understand your great-grandmother's saying about the Irish.
Okay. All right. Thank you again very much. I'm gonna, and I appreciate the participants. We had a good discussion today. Monte, thank you for helping me out. And there are chats. I'm gonna have to shut this off here soon. But next week, we're gonna have Gary Chartier. And then in 2 weeks, you're gonna have some guy, Forrest Howe. I'm not sure who he is, but I understand he's good. So we'll do that. And David wanted me to ask in general, are you interested in having Steve Daly come? Any great interest in that at all, anybody? We talked about him a few weeks ago. If you do, let David know or let me know. Okay, there's, I see one thumb up. So anyway, okay, so we now we're gonna have our closing benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. Thank you again, Bob.
You're welcome. Happy Sabbath.
Thank you.
Would someone send a strong wind to blow away the smoke that we're getting?
Yeah, we don't want it here, so you keep it.
Okay. Okay, we'll see you.
All right.
Okay,
Happy
bye.
Sabbath. Thanks, Forrest.
You're
Oh,
welcome.
and by the way, McKinley,
Yes.
we're gonna have to stop using the word bribe. I think gratuity would be a much nicer word.
Okay, we'll use gratuity. Have a good Sabbath.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.